Okay, we'll start. Okay, all right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first talk of CFPR seminar series for the new academic year. And as you can see, I think a lot of you already know me. My name is Chainan, and I'm a co-director of CFPR, and I will moderate today's seminar. So today we meet slightly earlier because our distinguished speaker, Professor Jim RAYMO, is joining us from the US Eastern Time Zone. So I know that it's quite late for Jim, so we are really grateful for this opportunity and for his willingness to spend time with us. So Professor RAYMO is Professor of Sociology and Henry Wendt III Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. So he has conducted extensive research on the causes and potential consequences of demographic changes associated with population aging in Japan. So his research includes analysis of marriage timing, divorce, recession and fertility, marriage and health, single mothers' well-being, solo living, family change, and social inequality, and so many other topics. So essentially, he's the expert of the demography of Japan. So in addition to many of his scientific contributions to family demography and the demography of Asia, I would also like to mention that Jim has been very instrumental in the growth and success of CFPR. He served as a member of CFPR International Advisory Board member when the center was established 7 years ago. And since 2020, Jim has served as the chairperson of our International Advisory Board. So we are definitely grateful for his long-term support for the center. So today we are very excited to hear about his new research findings on the pathway to first marriage in Japan. And given that Singapore is following Japan in various aspects of demographic trajectories, so many of us here are keen to learn what Jim's new work has to say. So without further ado, please let me now hand over to Jim. And for the audience, if you have any question, please feel free to type in your question and comment on the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will compile them towards the end of the presentation. So Jim, please.
Thank you, Puk, so much for the nice introduction and especially for the invitation. Also, I should say it's really nice to see so many friends and friendly faces here for the meeting. It's been too long, and I can't wait for the opportunity to see everybody in person. As Puk was saying, I have a long history with CFPR and have had many wonderful visits to Singapore for conferences or for meetings for the center, and am very disappointed, of course, that I'm not there right now, but I guess this is better than nothing, and we'll, as I said, look forward to an opportunity to see you all there in Singapore when the opportunity arises, hopefully next year. So let me go ahead and try to share my screen here, and you will tell me if everything looks good.
Yep.
Does that look okay?
Yeah.
And let me just make sure. Okay, good. All right. Hang on one sec. Let me go back. Okay. So as Puk said, this is new work. It's about the pathways to marriage in Japan, with a particular focus on cohabitation and pregnancy. And I will articulate why we're looking at those particular aspects of the pathway to first marriage in Japan in a minute. But let me say just a little bit more about the collaborators on this. This is not just me. There are 4 more co-authors on this. And in fact, I am not the first author. The first author is a young scholar named Ryohei Mogi, who is a postdoc currently at the University of Oxford. Wonderful young scholar who has done a lot of work, particularly in formal demography, around aging, family formation, and all of the things I'm interested in as well. And the others are 3 of my long, middle, and short-term collaborators at the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research in Tokyo. So this is a collaborative study, and B, it is very, very much work in progress. The results that I'm going to show you, they're very simple descriptive results. They have been put together by Ryohei very recently So kind of the proverbial hot off the press results. I think that you may be the first to actually see these results. An earlier version may have been presented at PAA, I can't remember, but the results I present today haven't been shown anywhere else. So hopefully, as Puk was saying, the pretty dramatic changes that I think we'll be able to show taking place in Japan are relevant for thinking about what's happening in Singapore and perhaps Asia more broadly, East Asia in particular, but perhaps Asia more broadly. So I hope that this is interesting to those of you who are interested in family change, but may not have a focus on Japan per se. Oops, sorry. So let me see. I'll get this right here in just a second. There's a little delay. Sorry. Okay, so our specific, sorry.
Good time.
Yeah, our specific research goals are the following. So we want to describe, as I said, pathways to marriage in Japan, focusing on cohabitation and pregnancy in particular. And we want to focus on change over time and differences by socioeconomic status, which we will conventionally proxy using educational attainment. We'll be focusing on women or couples, first marriages. I'll talk a little bit more about the data in a minute. But what we really want to try to do here is to think about some of the distinctive features of family change in Japan, particularly the pathways to marriage, in the context of broader theoretical frameworks, particularly the frameworks of the second demographic transition and diverging destinies. Obviously, everyone on this in this meeting is familiar with research on the second demographic transition. Perhaps not everybody is familiar with diverging destinies. I'll talk a little more about that. But the rationale here is that in my reading of research on family change and low fertility in Japan, there's relatively little attention to these broad, purportedly universal frameworks of family change. And one might argue that there isn't attention to these frameworks because Japan doesn't conform to the general patterns underlying these frameworks. But I think that I, along with my co-authors, see that as a real missed opportunity, by which I mean, we see real value in thinking about the ways in which distinctive patterns of family change and distinctive patterns of family formation in low fertility settings can help us understand the ways in which context is relevant for understanding patterns of change associated with the demographic transition and diverging destinies. This is nothing new. This is what I see our job in a field and a world dominated primarily by research on the US. I see this as part of our job to really think about how we can contextualize sort of conventional theories and think about the circumstances in which they do or don't make sense. So that's really where we're coming from in this. So I want to start with a little bit of data. I don't like it when people give presentations and talk for 30 minutes without showing any data. So I want to show a little data. I'm going to show some information here in select countries on non-marital fertility here, and in the next slide on cohabitation. So this shows trends over time between 1960 and the present in the percent of children born to unmarried mothers, so non-marital fertility. And I picked a few countries strategically. The dark blue is Sweden, sort of the prototypical second demographic transition country. The light blue is the US, the most widely studied, arguably, country. But the ones I really want you to pay attention to are kind of the orange and brown. These are Italy, Ireland, and Spain. Other familistic, low fertility countries that had very low levels of non-marital fertility through the mid-70s, late 70s. And you can see in this dotted oval that I've included here, I don't know if my cursor shows up for you to see, but right here, Japan and Korea, the two red lines, looked a lot like these Southern European and countries in Ireland. And then something happened in the late 70s and early 80s where these Mediterranean countries and Ireland really experienced rapid growth in non-marital fertility. You can see that almost half of births in Spain now are to unmarried women, and nothing changed in Japan and Korea. And I think this is one of the reasons why we don't think about Japan and Korea in the context of the second demographic transition, given that non-marital fertility is so central, and given that that's probably the most distinctive feature of these countries demographically in the context of low fertility, the very low levels of non-marital fertility. So this is one figure. And this is another one. This is not trends. This is cross-sectional data for, I believe, 2011, 2010. And what this shows is the distribution of partnership status in those same countries, minus Korea, which I don't have data for. And the blue, and these are for women 20 to 34, so relatively young women. The majority of young women in all of these countries are unpartnered, the gray. The blue is married, and the most important one here to focus on is the green, those who are currently in cohabiting unions. And you can see that Italy is pretty low, but Japan stands out with essentially no cohabitation in the cross-section. So when we look at a cross-section, a point in time, we see recently, 2010, that only 1% of women in this age group report being in cohabiting unions. So two really distinctive features of the Japanese context with respect to these two fundamental features of the second demographic transition. So what we want to do is to think about these patterns in the context of these frameworks with attention to distinctive features of the Japanese context. And as I'll talk about in a little bit more in a minute, that 1% that I just showed you shouldn't tell you that cohabitation is rare in Japan. It should tell you that long-lived cohabiting unions, marriage-like cohabiting unions, are rare. Short-lived cohabiting unions are not rare. So, but they're obviously hard to pick up in the cross-section because by definition, they are short-lived. Among cohabiting unions, one of the things I want to talk about is heterogeneity in cohabiting unions in Japan and measurement of cohabiting unions. But I want to emphasize that in some cases, cohabiting unions are essentially the same thing as marriage prior to formalization and registration. Like most East Asian countries, Japan has a registration system. You formally register marriages. It's put in the family register. But people don't always do that at the same time that they get married in reality. So they start living together as married. So this gap between the beginning of marriage and the formalization and registration of marriage is something that we can think about as cohabitation, but is typically not measured as cohabitation. So this is one of the innovations in this study, is to incorporate this sort of distinctive type of cohabitation into our measure of cohabitation. Other distinctive features of the Japanese context, I showed you very low non-marital fertility, but that should not tell you that premarital sex and premarital pregnancy are rare, because premarital pregnancy is quite common. And there are high levels of pregnancy that are legitimated by marriage. So what we used to call shotgun marriages in the US, what we've called bridal pregnancy in our research on Japan. And in an earlier paper that I'm going to talk about in a minute, we emphasize the potential role of cohabitation as a first step in legitimation. So all the research that has been done on cohabitation, we know that it's a more intimate arrangement than dating relationships, higher levels of sexual frequency, higher levels of pregnancy, presumably, and maybe a step in the process to pregnancy and subsequent legitimation via marriage. And one of the things that we've really argued in our work is that if we look at marriage in Japan, there are many reasons that people marry. But there are also many reasons why people don't marry and postpone marriage. And in this context, it seems that pregnancy is one very strong impetus to marry. in the absence of other strong reasons. So we really want to pay attention to the role of pregnancy and legitimation of pregnancy when we think about pathways to marriage and the way that that intersects with cohabitation. And I already mentioned delayed registration of marriage. So this is just the abstract of a paper that I published several years ago with colleagues Miho Iwasawa and Larry Bumpus, when we looked at some of the first available data on cohabitation experience and duration, and described the way in which cohabitation was related to marriage and its interrelationships with pregnancy, and found some very surprising findings, in particular, relatively high levels of cohabitation, surprisingly high levels of cohabitation in relatively recent cohorts. However, this analysis was done with a small survey conducted in 2004. That's almost 20 years ago now. And a lot has changed in 20 years in Japan and in the rest of the world, obviously, as well. So what we really want to do is to try to update some of the findings from this earlier paper using newer data, large national survey data, and to extend and reassess some of the findings from this earlier paper. And as I said several times already in this talk, to try to situate those findings and the questions and the findings within these two broad theoretical frameworks of the second demographic transition and diverging destinies. How should we think about a second demographic transition in Japan? I hinted at this at the beginning, but there are many reasons to think about Japan as a sort of poster child second demographic transition country. Japan has had below replacement fertility longer than any other country for about, well, I'm not sure, I don't want to go to the mat on that one, but for a long time, almost 50 years now, the TFR has been well below replacement in Japan. Family landscape is also characterized by late marriage, high prevalence of lifelong singlehood, high prevalence of childlessness, relatively high levels of divorce and remarriage. Just to throw out a figure, I think recently about 20% of all marriages in Japan involve a formerly married man or woman. So remarriage is quite common. There's some evidence of changing attitudes, particularly attitudes around gender, attitudes around the sort of essentialness of marriage and having children. So some things that hint at that sort of attitudinal focus of the second demographic transition framework. So a lot of reasons to think of Japan as a second demographic transition country. But a lot of good reasons to think that Japan is a country where the second demographic transition is irrelevant. And as I said earlier, that may be one of the reasons we don't see so much research on the second demographic transition in Japan. I've already talked about the essentially negligible levels of non-marital childbearing, low levels of cohabitation, certainly low levels of cohabitation as an alternative to marriage, which I think we all will agree is sort of central to the second demographic transition articulation of family change. There's limited evidence of growing individuation. I mentioned some attitudinal change, but there's relatively little evidence of change in the attitudes around self-actualization or pursuit of individual goals. Maybe a little, but not so much, certainly not enough that Ron Listaga and others would say, individuation happening in Japan. So I think that's another reason to think that the SDT is not so relevant there. And Japan remains one of the most gender unequal countries in the wealthy world. Currently, the lowest performing country on the gender gap index, for whatever that means. But another thing that is sort of a strike against thinking about Japan as a second demographic transition country. So really a mixed, we have some things on one side, some things on the other side in terms of thinking about this. And this is really our question. How do we think about notions of a second demographic transition in low fertility countries where the prevalence of these two central family features, cohabiting unions and non-marital fertility, remain extremely low. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Singapore, all of these countries, I think we could make the same arguments about. And when we get together, I would love to have conversations with you about these same questions in other countries in Asia, and hope that maybe what I say today might push somebody to start thinking about this in other settings as well. That would be absolutely fantastic. So I've talked about the second demographic transition. What about diverging destinies? So if I was sitting in the conference room at CFPR right now, I'd ask for a show of hands. How many of you are familiar with this notion of diverging destinies? But I can't do that right now. So I'll just assume that there are at least a few of you. Ah, there's one. Good. I can see Kojima-san, Hiroshi raising his hand. So I'll assume that there are a couple that may not be familiar with this. So I'll just briefly articulate these ideas and why we're interested in thinking about them in the Japanese context. So what I have here on the left is this very simplistic sort of stylized representation of the diverging destinies framework. And basically what we have on the vertical axis is the prevalence of some family outcome that has negative implications for children's resources. Think divorce, think non-marital childbearing, things that we know are negatively associated with children's resources. On the horizontal axis, we have time. And basically the idea is that at some point in the past, say the 70s, 80s, there was relatively little socioeconomic differentiation in divorce, non-marital childbearing, low levels, little difference. But over time, these have really diverged, where the red, low SES, it's increased for everybody, but increased more rapidly for those in low SES groups. And you have this bifurcation of family behavior associated with children's resources, which of course has implications for understanding processes of stratification and inequality, both within generations and across generations. So this is a hugely foundational, fundamentally important framework for thinking about the intersection of family and inequality in the US. But when we looked into this, we did Google searches on diverging destinies in Japan, diverging destinies in family in Japan, using the English language Google Scholar, Japanese language Google Scholar. I think we came up with about 7 papers, and I think 3 of them were mine. So I think that there's relatively little attention to this in the Japanese context, which I will argue is unfortunate. And I hope by the end of the talk, you will agree with me that it's unfortunate. So what do we know about educational gradients in cohabitation and non-marital childbearing? Well, I'll show you in a minute that there is a negative gradient in cohabitation, but it's not strong. We demonstrated this in our earlier paper, and I'll show you again here. With respect to bridal pregnancy, shotgun marriages, there's an extremely strong negative educational gradient that we have documented in earlier work, and I will show you again with these new data today. And with respect to non-marital fertility, this is almost completely unstudied, but I'll show you one graph in the next slide that suggests that there's not a lot of difference by mothers' educational attainment in non-marital fertility. These are figures from a little monograph that I published a few years ago with Miho Iwasawa on diverging destinies in Japan. And the top is the predicted probability of non-marital childbearing by birth cohort. The bottom right is the predicted probability of bridal pregnancy by birth cohort across 5 levels of educational attainment for mothers. And the blue you should probably just ignore. Those are high school dropouts, junior high school graduates, who, for those of you who study Japan will know, is an extremely small and very distinctive group, particularly in recent years, that is very interesting, but is very small and very, very different in other ways. But if you look at the red line and the black line, here for non-marital childbearing, you see a little increase, maybe a little divergence, but not too much. So we don't really see, the levels are low and the differences are small. With respect to bridal pregnancy, if we compare the black line, university graduates, and the red line, we see this sort of, stereotypical scissor pattern, this diverging pattern, whereby the increase is much more rapid for the low educated group, with potential implications for children's well-being. So I'm probably taking too long, so I'll speed up a little bit. This is just a figure from the previous paper, the 2009 demography paper, in which we looked at relationships between pregnancy, cohabitation, and marriage, and how they differ by educational attainment. And I don't want to go through this in much detail, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. So if you see, we have this by 4 educational groups across the horizontal: high school or less, vocational, junior college, university. And in each one, we have a group that did not cohabit and a group that reported ever cohabiting. And these are the cumulative life table proportions who had bridal pregnancy, who had marriage and a child, and marriage and no child. So you can see that about 80% of low educated women have married. And you can also see in the red down here that the prevalence of bridal pregnancy is about twice as high for those who cohabited relative to those who did not cohabit. It's also twice as high for the university graduates, but the levels are much, much lower. And you can see that pregnancy is not really a key component of the family formation process for highly educated women. However, this red line, this sort of diagonal red oval, suggests that relative to other groups, the role of cohabitation in promoting marriage, perhaps cohabitation as a trial marriage, appears to be stronger for the highly educated. The difference is larger there. So these are some of the things that we want to try to reassess, reevaluate, and think about in the context of these theoretical frameworks. We're going to be using data from a survey that Professor Kojima knows very, very well, the National Fertility Surveys that have been conducted every 5 years for many, many years in Japan. And the beauty of these data now is that after many years of not collecting information on the timing of cohabitation and cohabitation for married couples, that information now exists. So we can focus on first marriages, examine cohabitation prior to marriage, examine duration of cohabitation, the timing of pregnancy vis-a-vis marriage, the timing of engagement and its role in the marriage process, the timing of living together as married. This was something I mentioned earlier, this sort of delay between living together as a married couple and registering the marriage, okay? And thinking about that as cohabitation. So I apologize for the Japanese here. Some of you will be able to read it, others will not. But the key point here is that in this survey, there's information on the timing of beginning of married life. When did you start living together as married? There is information on the registration of marriage. When did you formally register your marriage? There's information on the timing of engagement. When did you get engaged or agree to marry? And there's information on duration of cohabitation prior to marriage with one spouse. So this is beautiful. And this is the first time this information has been available in Japan. This is available in the 2010 and 2015 surveys. We're using both. So just to follow up a little bit here, I mentioned this period between starting living together and registration of marriage. It's something like what's the word I want? Common law marriage or de facto marriage. And we want to treat this as cohabitation because I think typically in most countries, it is treated as cohabitation, but it's not something that's picked up in the question, did you cohabit with your spouse prior to marriage? So we have a few different scenarios here where we have people in A, this red line, yeah, I cohabited with my spouse prior to marriage, and we started married life at some point, and then we registered our marriage at some later point. So we have two different types of cohabitation red plus green equaling the total duration of cohabitation. We have people who registered their marriage at the same time they started married life. So they were prompt, and they may have cohabited prior to marriage or not. And we have this duration of cohabitation. We have people who delayed registration but didn't report cohabiting, but they have this de facto marriage or this common law marriage period. It's probably common law marriage is not the right word, but you know what I mean. So we have this duration of cohabitation, and we want to count all of these as cohabitation. And I'll give you the punchline right now. Sorry, this new way of measuring cohabitation, the green lines, it's relevant, but not so important. The conventional measure of cohabitation, did you cohabit prior to marriage, is much, much more relevant in understanding levels and duration of cohabitation in Japan. So I'm getting towards the end here, into the results. I'm going to show you 6 figures that look just like this. So let me walk you through the first one carefully, and then the others will be easy to see. So remember, the sample that we're looking at is women in their first marriage. And we are looking at them here by marriage cohort, late 90s, early 2000s, late 2000s, 2010 to 2015. And what I want to do here is to show you the composition of these marriages, first marriages, with respect to the pathways. And I want to focus here on just cohabitation. And what I've done is to show you, and we're going to incorporate the information on engagement, sort of formal engagement within marriage. It's interesting, maybe not centrally important, and I don't know if it'll be in the paper ultimately, but it's here. And I'm going to divide all of these figures into gray and blue. Gray is the conventional pathway to marriage. No cohabitation, no pregnancy. Marriage with engagement or without engagement, but no second demographic transition behaviors, no cohabitation, no pregnancy. And you can see that that was 78%, sorry, in the late 90s cohort. So what, 22% experienced cohabitation of one of these forms. And by the most recent cohort, we can see that the conventional pathway to marriage is barely a majority, 53%. And the remaining 47% experience cohabitation prior to marriage. So despite the fact, again, just to reiterate, despite the very, very low cross-sectional prevalence of cohabitation in Japan, if we look at it in a retrospective way and examine whether or not people experienced either of these 2 types of cohabitation, roughly half do. So cohabitation is common, bottom line. What about by education? So we have 3 educational groups here, high school or less, subsuming that strange high school dropout group with the lowest category, vocational and junior college and university. And you can see that the conventional pathway to marriage is somewhat higher among the highly educated, but there's not really a lot of difference. 69% of the highly educated don't experience cohabitation, 65% of the less educated. But remember that this is covers the entire period, the mid-1990s to the late 2000s. Educational attainment has changed during this period. So we're mixing up cohort and education here. So what about pregnancy? So here we have a similar figure where we look at marriage cohorts, and we can see that in all of these marriage cohorts, roughly 20% of first marriages are preceded by pregnancy. This is something that Miho Iwasawa and I have shown, she has shown, others have shown in their work on Japan. Depending on the data, it may be a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower. But the point here is that it hasn't changed all that much. Roughly 1/5 of all marriages in Japan are preceded by, all first marriages in Japan are preceded by pregnancy. But if we look at differences by educational attainment, you can see a different story. And I mentioned earlier that in our earlier work, we demonstrated a very strong negative educational gradient, and you'll see that again here. 90% of the university graduates follow a conventional pathway to marriage. as opposed to only 74% of the low educated. So what's that? 25, roughly a quarter of first marriages for the low educated are preceded by pregnancy. And this is, again, figures that are similar to previous research. So we really see strong differences in the role of pregnancy. But what we want to do in this study is to put these two together, to think about pregnancy and cohabitation in conjunction with each other. And in the paper, the first author, Ryohei Mogi, who has done all of the data work, has put together these very complex tables that describe the prevalence of all of the different possible pathways to first marriage. But I didn't want to subject you to that torture in a Zoom presentation. So I've sort of concatenated all of those into 4 simple groups. The gray is conventional, marriage without cohabitation or pregnancy. The dark blue at the bottom is marriage with cohabitation but not pregnancy. The middle blue is pregnancy without cohabitation. And the lighter blue is marriage preceded by both cohabitation and pregnancy. And what you can see here is that by the most recent cohort, the conventional marriages are a minority. 44% of first marriages in the most recent marriage cohort are what we might think of as typical marriages in the depiction of the homogeneous family life course in Japan that prevailed until the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 90s perhaps, or even mid 90s here. But the majority of marriages in recent marriage cohorts are preceded by either either cohabitation and or pregnancy. So a real change. And you can see here, again, not surprisingly, that there are real differences by educational attainment consistent with the Diverging Destinies framework, showing that about half of marriages for the lowest group are conventional as opposed to about a little over 60% for the highest group. And to the degree then that cohabiting unions and pregnancy before marriage are associated with unplanned childbearing, unplanned marriage, perhaps less stable marriages, these patterns have real implications, I think, for understanding the intersection of family change in these dimensions and potential differences in children's access to resources, children's well-being. This is something that we're working closely on in some other research using data from the Japan Child Panel study, a panel survey being conducted at Keio University. So I'll wrap up, I think, on time with just a few minutes to ask, what do we make of this? So I've shown you a lot of data, I've thrown out a lot of ideas, but what do we make of this? Well, I want to reiterate something that I just said, which is that I think, especially when I present this work in the US or European context, everybody has in their mind a stereotypical view of the family life course as very homogeneous in Japan, and are always surprised when I demonstrate how incredibly not true that is. So I hope I've convinced you that the idea of a very homogeneous pathway to first marriage is no longer apt in Japan. Indeed, marriage without cohabitation or pregnancy, as I just showed, is a minority pathway. We showed little evidence of educational differences in cohabitation, but a strong negative gradient in pregnancy, bridal pregnancy. So can we think about a Japanese pattern of the second demographic transition, or a Japanese pattern of diverging destinies? Or let's get bold and think about the degree to which these patterns may be broadly relevant across East Asia or perhaps in Singapore. Can we think about the ways in which we may have many aspects of the second demographic transition and diverging destinies happening under the radar, so to speak, and happening under the radar because of that fundamental link between marriage and childbearing that hasn't changed, okay? And what I'd like to emphasize is, again, this link between marriage and childbearing, but thinking about the ways in which we see the rise in cohabitation, the rise in bridal pregnancy. And let's think about socioeconomic differences in cohabitation. We saw that they weren't that great. But if we go back to that earlier paper that we published, it might be the case that there are real differences in what cohabitation means. It might be more of a pathway to marriage, a trial marriage. Make sure this marriage is going to work among the highly educated, but a accidental pathway to marriage among the less educated, characterized by perhaps unintended bridal pregnancy. And to the degree that these two patterns have different implications for children's well-being, we can really think about the ways in which these under the radar changes in family formation, the marriage process, the marriage pathways may have implications for children's well-being. And I would also like to just throw out, by way of a last idea, a recognition that this paper focused on first marriages. And I didn't say anything about the fact that about 20 or 30% of people never marry, and many of those never partner, and would like to throw out the idea of non-partnering as a distinctive feature of the second demographic transition in Japan. That's not what we're talking about in this paper, but it's something that I think is well worth thinking about, talking about. So with that, I'll wrap up and very much look forward to comments and questions. I see 6 questions in the chat box already. Can't wait to see them. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. So let's just drive through, there are so many questions. So can I invite Pauline to ask your question? Yeah, you're muted, Pauline. Just.
Hello. Hi, Professor RAYMO. Thank you
Hello.
for your presentation. I'm wondering whether you think that because of your definition of marriage cohorts, do you think that part of your results could be driven by underlying changes in underlying composition? So yeah. I'm thinking about changes in age at marriage and changes in cohort sizes.
Yes, indeed. That's a wonderful question. And it's something that we have tried to deal with, but so far in a relatively superficial way. We've tried to eliminate young marriages or young respondents from the sample to avoid overemphasizing young marriages, or early marriages, I should say. But I would have to double check exactly how we've done things because, as I said, I haven't done the analyses myself. But I do know that we've made efforts on that front and are very well aware of the fact that changing age patterns of marriage across marriage cohorts, changes in the relationship between age and these 2 events, 3 events, 4 events of interest may have implications for what we see. So I would, if I can ask you to, sort of take something from this talk in terms of something you can share with somebody the next time you're talking about family change in Asia. Don't take home the 44% or the 56%. Take home the idea that the homogeneity that characterized pathways to marriage in Japan is no longer relevant, and that cohabitation and bridal pregnancy play an important role, an increasingly important role in pathways to marriage with potential implications for well-being, patterns of stratification. Don't worry so much about the numbers. We'll work on those because we are very well aware of exactly the issues you're talking about. So thanks for emphasizing that, and giving me an opportunity to clarify what I do want you to take away. So thanks.
Thank you.
Next is from Prof. Kuchima, who wants to share some slides on premarital cohabitation experience.
Great.
Prof, do you want to go ahead? You're muted too.
Yeah. Can you see the table that I?
Yep.
Coming.
It's
there we go. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. This is based on a web survey, cross-sectional survey, so there should be a lot of biases from event censorship and age truncation and other biases. But the
Beautiful.
cohabitation, premarital cohabitation experience has been rising more than you mentioned. Of course,
Yeah,
these
wow.
are the young married, so there's a lot of biases, but and there are also differences between the type of premarital cohabitation, marital decision before cohabitation, and cohabitation first. And did I mention that this was presented at the APA meeting this month? Anyway, at that time, Thai distinguished demographer Apishat asked me whether or not what the effect on cohabitation, I mean fertility in Japan, and I
Yeah.
responded in saying that previously it was what you described, but now it's changing, so that marital cohabitants practice probably cohabitation, and they don't have premarital pregnancies or post-marital childbirth as they did before. So it might be changing. And also, you mentioned that the educational gradient, but it was proposed by French demographer Michel Bozon in the 90s, and I applied it in my earlier work in cohabitation. In my premarital bivariate analysis, which was based on multivariate analysis, and you mentioned that diverging destinies in Japan, but recent American family sociologists found that the converging destinies among American couples, even though they decide to marry, they cannot, they cohabit because they don't have enough economic resources, or the women has to build up their careers. I don't know. In Japan too, it might be happening.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. Thank you for sharing this. And I would absolutely love it if you could share this with me, or your APA presentation. These are really some interesting figures. And again, back to the response to the first question, not only will the figures differ depending on survey mode, whether that's large national survey or internet monitor survey. They'll also depend on what group you're looking at. We were looking just at first marriages. This may be everybody. But the bottom line takeaway for me is the same. Cohabitation is very common in Japan, regardless of how you define it. And I think the question that you were asked at your presentation about the implications for fertility is hugely important. We're just sort of describing the prevalence of premarital pregnancy and its relationship with cohabitation. But if you think about this, the real important question, in my view, in a place like Japan, Korea, Singapore, is to what extent does this rise in non-marital cohabitation accelerate the transition to marriage and childbirth, and thus increase the TFR, or the reverse? Because this is an obvious policy target. You can't target cohabitation as a policy outcome, but it's certainly important to know. And I don't think that anybody has really tackled that in a real direct way, but I'm excited about this. So I can't wait to see what you've done, Kojima-san. Please send this. Yeah, great.
Okay, thank you. There's several more questions now. So we had about, maybe 10 minutes left. So I like to, Jim, for the sake of time, do you think you can read the comments and then?
Sure.
So first is from Sunita Singh about reproductive technology.
Okay, maybe Hiroshi, if you could unshare, that would make it easier to see everybody here.
Yeah, can you stop share? Let's see.
Okay, so the next question is from Sunita Singh, asking or saying that this was the first time to hear of the notion of diverging destiny, so I'm glad I explained it. I pointed to a little monograph on this. So Sunita, if you can send me an email, I'll be more than happy to share that with you. It's published by Springer, but it's ridiculously expensive. I hope no one here is a Springer person, but I'm happy to share a copy with you. So just send me an email. You can find my email online easily.
So next
So Jungmoo, curious about the educational distributions among those who did not make it to marriage, namely those who got engaged but ended up breaking up or divorcing. Great question, interesting question. I can't answer it with these data. I can tell you a little bit about what I know about these issues from other research that we have done recently. So, and I'm just going to focus on women for the time being, because in the data we're using and much of the data available, like much demographic data, is on women. So forgive that. People who didn't make it to marriage. So what we do know is that Japan has been one of the few countries in recent years where the highly educated women were still less likely to marry. So consistent with old conventional hypotheses of independence and so on. But a paper that I published with two of the co-authors of this paper last year in Journal of Marriage and Family, we showed that that disappeared. So there really is no educational gradient in marriage among women right now. There's a huge educational gradient in marriage among men in Japan. Same pattern as everywhere. I think China may be extreme, perhaps on this one, but in Japan, for women, there's relatively little gradient now. We've done a lot of work on divorce, and it's clear that there's a very strong negative educational gradient in divorce in Japan, as there is in the US and many other countries. So what I can't do is to tell you how cohabitation and pathways to marriage play into this. And that would be another great set of questions. So along with some other colleagues, we just published a paper on marriage intentions and lifelong non-marriage, and this idea of drifting into non-marriage, drifting into lifetime singlehood. And one of the things that is really interesting in that conversation is the role of cohabitation and failed cohabitations that broke up. And we didn't have the data to do that, but that is an absolutely fundamentally interesting question that could again be linked in a really more ambitious framework to trends in TFR. To what degree does the rise in cohabitation, the high prevalence perhaps of cohabiting breakups, and the implications for repartnering, the time it takes to get to marriage, the likelihood of non-marriage, what are the implications of that for TFR? Boy, that would be fantastic to study, yeah. Thank you, yeah, that's a great idea. I wish we had the data. So from Hao Dong has a question. Last figure, highly educated, has the highest proportion of the conventional pathway and the cohabitation only pathway. Yes, that's correct. What are minimal relative? Okay, so I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but let me answer what I think you're asking and tell me if I got it wrong, okay? So what I think is going on here, underlying the relatively high, but still not so high, prevalence of conventional pathway to marriage among the highly educated, but relatively little difference in cohabitation, is that the low educated women really differ in terms of one thing: premarital pregnancy and the role of pregnancy in leading to marriage. And what I would argue about fertility and tension, I don't have great data on this, but we have written work on this in the past. And yeah, unplanned pregnancies leading to marriage are more common among the less educated women, lead to early marriage, lead to unplanned births. But we don't know so much about the degree to which that's what's underlying the patterns we see, or whether it has to do with some fundamental differences, as I was suggesting, in the meaning of these cohabiting unions. You know, maybe, as is the case in the US and elsewhere, for the less educated, cohabiting unions might just be a convenient way to spend time together. Why not? And you end up getting pregnant. We haven't talked about contraceptive environment in Japan. That's very different and relevant here, but I won't go into that. But the flip side to that would be the possibility that cohabitation is much more like a trial marriage, much more like as Hiroshi was just showing, a cohabitation subsequent to deciding to marry pattern among the highly educated. So I really don't know, but please tell me if that didn't answer your question.
How Dong, are you okay?
Yeah, I mean, I was just find that's fascinating because you know, that highly addicted groups have the lowest proportion with those pathways who are not related to fertility at all. So in that way, it's like whether it is because they don't want children at all. So that's why you find, okay, either they're cohabiting or they directly enter the marriage. So that was my question. So it's not just related to their later marriage decision, but also to that even later, you know, their fertility decision. So that was my question. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. But I think you already answered that greatly. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Let's talk about this more when we have a chance to meet. I'm real interested in this. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Next is
all right, all my friends have questions here. Adam, let's see. Let me go down here. Adam says
questions.
2 questions. I'm sure they're not stupid questions. What's the educational composition of the young married population over time? How good is education, especially okay. There's an expansion of education. So these are absolutely not stupid questions, Adam. These are great questions. So the educational composition of young married population has changed over time in a very important way. So educational attainment has increased over time in Japan, as it has in most other countries. But say, unlike the Korean context, for example, where there's this massive increase in higher education attendance, the thing that's happened in Japan, particularly over the period that we're looking at, particularly for young women, is not an increase in attending higher education, but a shift from 2-year colleges to 4-year colleges. So the more recent marriage cohorts are much more well represented by 4-year university graduates. The extent to which those new 4-year graduates who would have been 2-year graduates 20 years ago in a different regime are really different than today's 2-year college graduates, I don't know. So, you know, you have this real issue of selection and changing selection that makes it really hard to compare over time, which we haven't been doing, but that's a good question. Education is a predictor of SES for women. That's also a good question. And to the degree that there are relatively few, so Japan has very high female labor force participation, but it also has relatively low career trajectories, career employment. And it's not the case, for example, that high education is something that will put many women on the lawyer, the executive, the professor, well, obviously professor, but these career tracks in ways that may have implications for marriage and childbearing as they do in the US. So that's a good question that I don't know how to answer, and I don't know that there's a better measure. Assortative mating and the educational assortative mating, a high degree of educational homogamy, and the role of men's education as a very good proxy of SES means that to some degree women's education is indirectly a good proxy of SES. So those are just some thoughts on that. The second question is about regional variations. And is that partly due to more young people staying in metropolitan areas such as Tokyo? So that also is not a dumb question. That's a very good question. But I would suggest that the answer to that is no, because in the period we're looking at, the young people are already in major urban centers. I don't think that there's substantial small area to large urban area migration in the period we're talking about. That was much earlier in the Japanese context.
So, Adam, any response?
You're muted.
I don't think he's muted, but there are some issues.
Oh.
Anyway, we'll
Okay.
come back to you later. I hope that, I mean, I would love this to be more interactive, but we are running out of time, and I know like this is 11 p.m. in Jim's time. So we'll take a few more questions. Next one is from Cheng Cheng.
Hang on just a second here.
No change.
Okay, hang on just a second. I was opening the thing from Hiroshi and I lost things for a minute here. Okay, from Chen Chen, I'm wondering, are these changes happening with or without major shifts in attitudes towards cohabitation? Great question. And I would, Chen, you know me well, and you know that I would like to give you a precise answer. And I can't because I don't know off the top of my head. So I'm gonna give you an answer with the caveat that I would like to look into this more. But my impression, based on readings that I don't remember real well at this point, is that there has been a shift in attitudes towards cohabitation, with relatively more acceptance of cohabitation as a reasonable thing to do. In that earlier paper, the 2009 paper that I mentioned, we used these older data from a different survey, and they asked the currently unmarried if they would be interested in cohabiting. That's a very strange question. It's a direct translation, something I can't remember exactly, but about a third said yes. And we took that as a pretty strong indicator that this is not, any kind of stigmatized relationship. Although I would argue when I first went to Japan in the mid 80s, this was most assuredly a stigmatized relationship in many ways. So on all of those sort of vague memories and anecdotal understandings, I'm going to say, yes, there has been change. But let me look it up and let's talk about that again when we have a chance to meet. Yeah, okay, that's a great question.
Shushu had, oh wow, Shushu had question and Jean also had question.
Okay, so just one short comment from Shushu. You can go ahead and ask if you want, rather than me reading. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure, Jim. I mainly want to discuss a little bit more about the left 20-30% of non-marriage. By saying that, I mean like, is this Japanese model of SDT is temporary? If those pathway towards non-marriage increase just like the Western, in that case, how can we say this is a Japanese model of SDT?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and again, not part of the presentation, but something I would love to talk about. And it has increased pretty steadily. Marriage was universal 25 years ago. If we look at the percent of 50-year-old women never married, it was about 5 or 6% in the 70s. It's about 18% now, projected to go up to about 20-25%. And that, I don't think that there's much chance of this being a tempo effect, because unless there's massive changes in marriage at older ages, at least for cohorts currently aged 30 and up, the level of non-marriage is going to be 20-25%, I think. But the real question is, what happens later? Cohorts now age 20 or something. There's no guarantee, of course, that this will continue to increase. But the thing that makes this really interesting to me, and it came out a little bit in that comparative slide showing the distribution of union status is that because cohabitation, even though it's common, it's short-lived, it often leads to marriage, and there aren't many of these second demographic transition type marriage-like cohabitations, long-term cohabitations, cohabitations that involve childbearing. So what this really means when we see this increase in non-marriage in Japan, it means non-partnered life in a way that I think it doesn't necessarily mean in Europe or the United States. Of course, it could be the case that there's a lot of lats living apart together couples. I don't know that. But I think when I think about things like the emphasis on individuation in Listaga's writing about the second demographic transition, pursuing your own goals, prioritizing your own self-actualization. And it may be that in a context where marriage and childbearing are tightly linked, where marriage means very specific things for specific types of people, that simply avoiding marriage may be a way of self-actualizing. And to that extent, I mean, this is kind of provocative, and I don't know if I believe it or not, but I think it's worth thinking about that as part of a distinctively Japanese pattern of the second demographic transition.
Sorry, Jim, just very short question. So
yeah, sure.
Did you see any trend among the old couples? You know, when the wife are losing husband, they tend to cooperate. What is the trend for the older ages?
I do not know. In terms of cohabitation, or
in terms of cohabitation.
I can't answer that. I don't know. The data that we have go up to age 50.
I see. I see.
And so we really don't have information. If I were going to just speculate, like I was doing in my response to Chen Chen earlier, I'm going to say that cohabitation at older ages is very uncommon. If there are romantic unions, I'm going to guess that lat type unions are much more common, but cohabitation is not. But that's just me making up stuff based on intuition and anecdotal evidence. So take it for what it's worth. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Hi, Jean.
We have one.
Jim, how are you?
From Jean, and may I ask question too? And it's along the same line with Jean's comment, is the role of policies and policy response to this trend. And Jean, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
No, please share your comments.
Oh, Jim, this is fascinating. I just see a lot of similarities between Japan and Singapore. Right? Arguably, these are the two most modern, advanced society in Asia. But there are also many differences, and that is I think a lot of it is driven by the policy. So, for example, there are much higher divorce rate and cohabitation rate in Japan than in Singapore, and here it's lower cohabitation rate because the public housing policy make it almost impossible for people to rent or buy in private properties, and people have to wait until they get married to get public housing, which is a crucial aspect in their lives. So that's just one example of how I think my criticism of the second demographic transition is that it takes very little account of a few things. One is, policy. The other one is the cultural aspect, which again, we see very strongly in Asia, this insistence in linking the legal marriage to childbearing, right? And so there's no alternative for people to make changes. So if there isn't this, government insists on not recognizing children outside of childbearing, I think the second demographic transition will run its course probably in many places. I found it very interesting that you said there's very little evidence of the individualism in Japan.
I don't want to say very little. I want to say not striking evidence. Yeah.
Okay, so then I would think of how do you explain the large proportion of non-marriage and non-childbearing in Japan, and what is driving that? Of course, you can say that, you know, the lack of the gender inequality, the lack of institutional adjustment, and all that. I am also wondering about, you know, it's interesting, unique that Japan kept the female education relatively low, right, around 50%, as opposed to 80%, 100% like Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. And I don't know, that is one of the reasons why, you know, maybe you see less individualism there. Another reason I could think of is the religion. You know, Japanese may claim that they are atheists, many of them, but in fact, they practice the Shinto and Buddhism. I think the statistic is at least 70%, 80% of them actually believe that there's some supernatural forces in their lives. So, you know how second demographic transition talked about lack of religion in people's life and secularization. And that's part of the reason why it's driven all the changes. I just wonder, you know, the culture in Japan, these are some of the factors that I could think of, the culture, that including the gender inequality, religion, and policy, patriarchy that's still so strong. I don't know about women, but Japanese men seems to be pretty individualistic to me. So I think those are some of the reasons why, you know, second demographic transition hasn't run its full course yet. And that may be true in Singapore as well.
Goodness, Jean, that's an awful lot to think about. And I'm going to repeat what I was saying to others earlier. This is absolutely a conversation for when we are able to get together in Singapore. This is fascinating. I don't think that I can respond to all of those, but I'll just throw out a few thoughts on these ideas. So with respect to individuation and marriage, and thinking about the growing prevalence of non-marriage or lifelong singlehood as a potential manifestation of growing individuation, I can see where one might make that argument. But I think if we just look at the data and trust people on their stated intentions around marriage and childbearing, I think it's still the case that large majorities of men and women indicate that they would like to marry, they'd like to have a family, they'd like to have kids. And I would say, rather than in Japan, growth in individuation and a move away from the family in a kind of intentional way is growth in ambivalence. This paper that we just published in Demographic Research really shows that when you give people options to, you know, sort of give them finer gradations of intentions, yeah, some people are very strongly feel very strongly about the importance of marriage and childbearing, but the majority feel if it happens, great. If it doesn't happen, that's okay. So I think there's real ambivalence, and I don't know where ambivalence fits into the second demographic transition framework. I don't think it's in there at all. So this is also something to think about. So I threw out that provocative idea of growing lifelong singlehood as part of a second demographic transition, perhaps reflecting individuation. But right after that, if you recall, I said, I'm not sure if I believe it myself, but I'd like to think about it. So I'm not sure. about that, but I want to think this through a little bit more. And then with respect to religion, that's a really interesting point you bring up, Jean. So as I understand the second demographic transition emphases on changing adherence to social institutions that played an important role earlier, it's really a move away from religion that's important. And I don't know. I mean, my take on this is a little different than yours, and I would be happy to hear what Professor Kojima has to say about this, because I know he's very interested in religion and family in many contexts, including Japan. But my take is that yes, 80%, 90% of Japanese identify as Buddhist or other religion. Yes, religion is relevant. For some people, it's very relevant. There are certain sects of Buddhism that are very religious in terms of the adherence, religiosity. But my impression is that religion is more of a sort of, it plays a role in sort of formal events, marriages, New Year's, death, birth, things like this, but it's not really a part of people's everyday life in the way that it is in the United States, certainly in terms of shaping people's decisions about family. I would argue that religion probably plays very, very little role in decisions about family formation. But Hiroshi, do you want to throw anything else in there on that? I think it's a fascinating question.
I'm not a specialist on religion, but that depends on the definition of religion. The definition of religion in East Asia is much different from those Abrahamic religions. So I don't know. Oh.
Okay, yeah. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Japan Family Sociology Association's meeting in September on the effect of religion on what? Cohabitation? I don't remember.
Okay.
Sexuality, I forgot. But anyway, I prepare for that.
Sounds good. Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah, Jean, boy, there's a lot there. Anything that you want to follow up on? I know that I answered probably 1/5 of what you asked, but policy.
No, I think Book has questions. So I just wanted to say that we do have also work in Singapore on divergent destiny, but not based on divorce and non-marital birth, because those are relatively small numbers, but it's assortative marriages.
I want to follow up and ask you
marriages. It's very clear.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Great. So
thank you.
So thank you so much. I have learned a lot during this session. I know it's getting really late for Jim. And so by way of closing, I'd like to thank Jim for sharing with us his latest research. And we learned a lot, and I mean, it's actually generating a lot of hypotheses for us to think about. And hopefully when COVID situation gets better, we definitely would love to invite Jim back to Singapore. His talk was actually scheduled last year about this time, right? Before COVID, but that never happened. But hopefully, this will get better, and we could have you back in Singapore to continue this conversation in not too long. And so, thank you so much, Jim. And so stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you back next week. We'll have our second speaker from UCLA. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it. Great to see all of you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Time to go to bed.